It's 2020 and currently the world is experiencing a crisis like never seen before. The coronavirus has rapidly spread across the globe, collapsing industries, hospitalising thousands of people and resulting in many fatalities. It is now that we've decided to start the Skadi podcast to help those in the financial services navigate this very uncertain future. In our third episode, Nick chats with Martin about how Skadi has helped many financial institutions with investigations and review control work over the past few years. If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.
Okay, so this is the third episode of the Skadi podcast. Tonight you have myself, Nicholas Corrie, Managing Director of Skadi, and Martin Anthony, who is our Head of Business Development. But also has been one of our long-standing consultants working in audit areas and compliance. Martin, how are you doing? Good to see you, mate.
Very good, Nick. And yourself?
Yeah, I'm all right. Nice to see you on this out of office medium, all kind of different, but hey, that's the way we're all working. So Martin, you obviously have reasonable amount of experience now working in some of our review teams for Skadi. But what's your background? How did you find your way to Skadi? What's your experience in the financial markets?
Well, my city career started back in the late 80s, believe it or not, in foreign exchange operations. And I remember the first city job I had was essentially ringing up other London banks to confirm by phone whatever deal had just been passed to us from the dealers, which was very good fun. And I was doing foreign exchange trading a little bit towards the end of that as well, and then moved into listed derivatives with Morgan Stanley and Barron Securities. And was probably doing that for 3 or 4 years before spending the majority of my career in agency portfolio trading, so equity based. Again, that's with Barron Securities, as was ING that took them over, and then the Bank of New York. A varied career, but a very enjoyable one too.
So uniquely, you're one of our people that has worked, both in the front office, but also in the operations area. Because you mentioned obviously listed derivatives operations, I think, and FX operations too. So how different is it working in operations area from front office?
Well, I think it's a very good grounding. I think back in the day, I think the opportunities to move from an operations environment into a front office trading, sales, brokerage kind of role were more prevalent than they are today. But I think it was a really good grounding, from the back to front, to look at all the processes, look at all the controls that were there, and really get to grips with the nuts and bolts of how financial products really work. What the knock-on effect is. When a trade gets passed to the middle office, it gets or straight through into operations now, and the knock-on effects for settlements and payments and reconciliations of P&L. It was a great grounding, I think, back in the day.
I think it's interesting because you've had that sort of experience, and then taking that forward into your career with Skadi and working on the reviews and so on. How have you applied that knowledge, do you think, to some of the review and control work that you've been doing?
Well, I think over the years, you get regulations change, and you have various compliance officers coming to the desk, internal auditors coming to the desk, and talking you through the issues that they are seeing. So you've kind of seen it from the front office point of view over decades, really. And I think it was really interesting at the end of that career to sort of move into the more investigative side and review and control side of the same processes and procedures that I had been seeing as a head of sales trading, and really use the experience to view things in a slightly different way than maybe sort of control function officers would do, sort of auditors, compliance officers, because you can both look at the same set of procedures and controls, and on paper they look fantastic, they look watertight, but then just utilising that front office experience will just sometimes give you a slightly different take on potential weaknesses, should we say, that might be there, or things that just need to be tightened up a little bit more to make sure that they can't be exploited by people with detailed knowledge of market practices.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking of some of the the audit teams that you work with, and a number of them have asked you, particularly to come back again and again, which has always been nice for me, knowing that we've got that kind of repeat work with yourself, because you've always gone down very, very well, I think, with the customers that have used you. What is it you think in terms of the process that you really add coming into that whole kind of review process that kind of makes it more effective, more efficient?
Well, I think, and especially in times like this, with the moves that we've been seeing in the markets, and the spreads, the daily moves, just unprecedented, keeps cropping up over and over again. But it really is, and I think it's really important that the control functions are acting as efficiently as possible. And it's certainly not just me. I think all these Skadi experts that go in on these review and control investigations, they bring decades worth of experience. And I think you go in with an understanding of the product or the issue under review right from the first minute you walk through the door, because we tailor the experts to the specific needs of the client. And that's so important in making the process efficient, because the control officers, the auditors don't waste any time and resources getting up to speed on what the product, what the issue actually is. They can really hit the ground running with a Skadi member as part of their team, Skadi expert as part of their team. And I think that really does make a big difference. And
I think it's interesting. What I've tended to find myself is that there's so many aspects. But I think there's big challenges when you are in that any kind of review function, because you're not just reviewing that one particular business. Often you've been looking at a different business, and you won't have been into the business that you're looking at for probably 18 to 24 months, because you need to allow that business to continue to function, continue to grow. You can't be in there, disturbing what's happening. So there is always a certain amount of, refreshing, I think, getting yourself back up to speed with a business. And I think that's where I think I've had, myself most impact, I think, in terms of, getting to the heart of what people are looking at, more rapidly. And then I think, some of the interesting aspects I've found is, you do bring that subject matter expertise, but I think there's also a certain amount of translation that takes place as well, because, the colloquialisms that are used in front office, in certain businesses and so on, are often very difficult to cut through. I remember a situation, I was in where there was someone from audit talking to a trader, and they were both talking about spreads. And literally 2 minutes into the conversation, it was very apparent to me that neither of them were talking about the same kind of spread. The trader was talking about a spread to a benchmark, and the auditor was talking about the bid-offer spread. And they were both having a conversation very happily, but neither understanding each other. And it's that kind of lost in translation, I think, that can be one of the the challenges when you're working with people who are from very different backgrounds.
That's right. I think we've seen over the years where you've got an auditor or compliance officer who just wants to get to the bottom of an issue, and is having to interrupt a very busy head of trading, head of sales, who's really not going to give him very much time at all. And if the head of trading or sales can use any opportunity to make it sound much more complex than it really is, to brush somebody off and kick the meeting down the line a few times, they certainly will. And I think we've seen it happen, and it's just so nice to be on the other side as part of the control function team, not necessarily adding a little bit of firepower, but just being able to sort of ask the question when it needs to be asked, the relevant question. Where I think control function staff have a very difficult job at the best of times. Regulations change frequently. They've got to keep up to date on everything. They've got to make sure that the firm or the financial institution remains compliant at all times. So it's now especially it's even harder, I guess, with the remote working conditions that everyone's under. But the regulators have made it clear that while they will allow some sort of temporary relief on certain deadlines, thinking uncleared margin rules have been postponed slightly, the ultimate responsibility for remaining compliant remains with the firm, so that these control function professionals have to just get the job done. So I think any way we can help to cut through any layers of complexity that don't really need to be there and get to the bottom of the issue as quick as possible is tremendously valuable.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. I mean, it is going to be interesting to see through this process, because obviously, different way that everybody is working, and really a kind of almost microcosm and study at how quickly behaviours develop. Because I don't think we've seen any time in your and my career a period in which people have had to adapt and have been successful at adapting to an entirely new way of working. I mean, I think the only time I can think where there's been anywhere near the rate of adoption of a new way of working is really back at the start of your and my career. When we changed from using, fax machines and telexes to using, what was CC mail. It wasn't even email at that point. But that kind of changeover into how you could use, electronic communications to change the way that you worked. But that process took place over a number of years. What's fascinating about this period for the market that we're in at the moment and the industry that we're in at the moment, and particularly the control industry, is the fact that change has been enforced upon us, and it has been successful and adapted to in the space of a month. I mean, it really is, just aside of the operational infrastructure challenges, just the behavioural adaptation has been so quick in that time, and it will be very interesting to see how long that behavior, or whether there is a change in behavior when people at some point return to, let's say, the old way of working, if there is a return to the old way of working, because who knows at this point.
No, I think I agree. It's interesting. I think regarding office space and what you physically need to have in one location, I don't think will ever be the same again. And I think in general terms, it has worked very well. I know on the previous episode, from what the market participants we spoke to, in general, things have gone well. You do come across little stories where things have gone, potentially badly wrong, and I'm sure, years down the line, people will still be looking at various issues that have arisen, because no one could really plan for the events that took place. I think from a technology's point of view, you've got roles such as product control, trade surveillance, that have been sort of bubbling along nicely with the tech they had in the office, with the parameters all set for orderly trading, and the margins that everyone is expected to make. Everyone knows what the normal commission is on an equity in Europe, a few basis points if you're lucky. And then all of a sudden, spreads get pushed out, markets are flying up and down each day. And you think from a purely trade surveillance point of view and try to monitor market abuse, nothing would be the same again, because you're going to have to build in these eventualities, no matter how remote they seem from the outset, just to make sure you don't get caught out by something you would think that would never happen. I think, especially in the oil market, going negative. Yes, the CME signaled it 5 days before, but you find out about Indian brokers taking the local exchange to court because basically they didn't take any action, even though the CME warned that it was likely to happen. So these things are going to keep coming out for years and years, I'm sure. But I think in general, you're right. Technology has really played a big part in making this to pretty much a seamless process.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it's an amazing time, and I think When you think about the work that we end up doing, in review and control, just going back to that, is at the end of the day, a lot of that is about identifying, where controls need more resilience, or worse, they aren't there, and they need fixing and need repairing. In the run-up to that control being put in place, there is a certain amount of behaviour which will take place, that's had to take place to work around that control. So, what might be an example? An example might be a situation where, you have a particular set of model issues with a firm, and that has meant that other practices have been brought in other areas. So, for example, market risk, having to make adjustments to the risk reports because there are known failures in those risk reports. Or it might be finance, having to opt for some kind of bespoke reserving practices, and so on and so forth. And it's really, what I do find interesting is when these points are raised, and when they are effectively remediated, and when they are closed, I do think that there is probably not enough thought given to whether the behaviour that accompanied that lack of control has also changed, has also adjusted in light of the repaired control. I mean, that's a sort of, one aspect that I think, I'd like to see more follow-up from in the control functions that we work with. But again, it's down to time, because it's often not a luxury. It's, you're trying to close these points off and move on to the next item, if you like.
Exactly right. And I think, working in the environment where they have regulations that change frequently, when we go in and do a review, we look at the baseline regulation that they're trying to be compliant with. We look at the internal procedures. We'll interview key stakeholders to identify areas of risk, and point out where things need to be tightened up. But at the end of the day, as you say, it could just end up to be another box ticking exercise if the behaviour doesn't change. And I think that is vitally important. So I think the key is to make sure that the recommendations that we make as a company, really have an effect and change people's behaviour, for the better. I think, thankfully, with the repeat business that we've seen so far, we seem to be on the right track, should we say.
And you've changed role for us. You still obviously will go back for selected customers to go back and review, but you've now moved into the business development for Skadi. And how are you enjoying that?
It's great. It really has changed. Well, it changes so much, but I think we've seen rapid change on that side, with the financial institutions coming under pressure in terms of the resources that they can allocate, and the shift in focus to making better use of data, in the data that these large institutions have anyway, to try and streamline the process as much as we can. And I think being a small firm that's able to react quickly to change really plays to our strengths as well. So I think we've noticed the rapid development in technology, surveillance and market abuse monitoring, and I think it's great to be able to use the expertise that we built up over the years to direct firms to use it in the most efficient way. So I think the role hasn't stayed the same for long, should we say? So it's challenging but enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean it is interesting. I mean, you and I particularly, and others on the team, we are constantly developing the business, and that's been something that we've been used to, sitting in a room together in Southkey, back to back. How have you found, trying to develop ideas with the team, from your own front room?
Yeah, good and bad. Yeah, no, I think, well, going back to technology has been fantastic, and we chat every day. We can bounce ideas back and forth. We have shared drives. And within the limits of home broadband, thankfully, it's held up pretty well. Multiple screens, there hasn't been a large impact at all to the way we can get things done. I think what you maybe miss is just bouncing ideas quite so much off people, through in an office environment. And I think in the same way traders do on trading floors, you can pick up a sense of something that's going on without really being aware that you're listening. And I think it's that kind of like a buzz from an office environment that you do miss. But thankfully we can keep in regular contact with each other through Zoom and Skype and various other things, WhatsApp.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the conversations are going on out there now. People, tentatively are inquiring of their business lines. How would they like to return, or I say return, but what the next phase would be if it is signalling a return. And certainly our consultants have been asked, by the places they're working in, some of them anyway, what would they like to do? Would they be wanting to go back to some kind of split operation, getting some more office time? Would they find it beneficial for the work they're doing? Would they actually, or are they happy working on a home working basis? Do they need to be working on a home working basis because they've got someone vulnerable in the household that they need to shelter and therefore can't return to work? So, I mean, these are, unusual and unprecedented times. I think the point you make about, having all that time to kind of bounce ideas off, it is interesting that I think that our productivity has gone up quite a bit by being able to sort of switch that off and going away and having the time to implement some of those ideas.
Yeah, I think you could be right, actually. And I think, the whole the lots of institutions and firms out there adopted the A and B scenario, but it only really was around for a week or so before it was completely shut down. So you kind of think, most of the firms have commitments on office space. They probably are not going to make any big decisions for the short term and medium term anyway. So maybe A and B is the step that they go to initially, and then evaluate at the next proper renewal. Do they need the floor space? Do they need more hot desking and have more flexibility where they have some staff working from home on a more regular basis? But it's certainly going to be an interesting time. I remember at the start of the career seeing all the big disaster recovery and business continuity sites lying empty out in the East End of London and other places, and you kind of wonder what's going to happen to all of those.
Yeah, well, I think beyond that, I wonder about office space. I mean, we had a conversation with one head of a third line area, and they were definitely talking about that possibility, about what happens, whether the financial institution in question needs that much office space going forward, and whether there will be a rethink. I mean, people are only opining, I think, at this stage, but it is an interesting question because it's certainly, I think, opened everyone's eyes that there are, a lot of pluses to working in this way, and you get sort of some different things out of that. And certainly, you're never going to lose the need for that, face-to-face contact with people when you're reviewing. But again, you and I having face-to-face now, is that going to be, more convenient now to have that video conferencing type interaction? And, again, we are doing deep dive testing of data when we're looking at, the way that someone from a business has presented the manner in which they do things, and then we go away and test that. We find ways to test that. Well, that's work that can be done from any area. Doesn't necessarily have to be in an office, as long as you have the data and able to manipulate it.
I think sometimes the one thing I would say is when you get down to the sort of the nitty gritty of a review of procedures and controls, and you're interviewing the key stakeholders in an institution, very often it's nice to be in the room with that person and see exactly how they answer the questions, and whether you get a sense that there is follow-up questions that you should be asking, if you know what I mean. Sometimes remotely, it's hard to pick up on the subtle detail of what might be being withheld from you, maybe accidentally or maybe intentionally. But it's being in the room, I could see in certain sensitive situations might be quite useful.
Yeah, it is. But you know, we've always worked on, you know, with global businesses. You know, I mean, there has been more recently more kind of country-specific audits that we've worked on, but often we've worked on, you know, global audits of equity derivative businesses, credit derivative businesses, when you are talking to people that are in the Far East or talking to people that are in the States, and that has to be done in this way. So it isn't a wildly different way of working, but I do agree with you. There is certainly something for, you know, for body language and also some, you know, I think also just that that personable approach when you are trying to sell, you know, some of the audit points to people, to getting them to understand that, you know, you and the audit team, you know, you're trying to help close a gap, and there is a certain amount of diplomacy and selling that goes on, and that is, you know, better done face to face, I think, somehow, because, you know, people are human, and that human interaction helps in any kind of, you know, transaction, whether it's, you know, buying and selling a car, or whether you're actually trying to land an audit point or a compliance point onto somebody.
Definitely right. Yeah, definitely right. So, and maybe there'll be a lot more hot desking in the future. And I think if I'm in an institution and I quite like a desk and it's a hot desk environment, just make sure you take a pair of smelly trainers in with you and just leave them there when you go home in the evening. You should be okay for the next day.
That's one of your top tips. Thank you very, very much for that. Good stuff. All right, Martin. Well, thanks a lot for giving us those insights into review and control. Look forward to catching up with you anon.
Thank you for listening to episode 3 of the Skadi podcast. Stick with us on this journey as we, like many of you, are trying to navigate these very uncertain times. This is the Skadi podcast.